tira tēnā koutou e te haukainga. Kia koutou ngā kaiwhakahaere o tēnei hui. Kua karanga mai kia wau, kia atu, kia kōrero tahi, kia wānanga tahi. Kia whai huarahi mō o tātou whenua, tō tātou awa tipuna me te oranga o ngai tātou ngauri o Ngāti Porou, tēnā koutou. Kia kōrua tahi pī, rau ko tui, tautoko au ngā mihi kua mihia e taku tuahine nei, tui. And just also to say welcome to everybody who's come from afar as well. And I wanted to acknowledge, I feel very honoured also to be able to talk at home and have some awesome high calibre presenters and not have to travel to the hui to hear them. It's fantastic to have gatherings like this. I hope we have more of them. I feel particularly honoured also to sit alongside Tui and Pia. 2 decades ago when Pia was talking, as Tui mentioned, when they started doing a lot of their research, 2 decades ago I was in my 20s and was just considering starting research, and I remember, I think it was Wakahuia or Marae guys came up on TV, and I wasn't even living at home at the time, but I was hugely inspired and disturbed by their findings and the work of the Waipu back then. And I remember even back then saying, well, when it's time for me to move home, that's something I really want to be involved in. And 2 decades later, I've moved home, but the seeds were sown back then by the work that you were doing. So I feel really honoured to be able to present alongside you, and thank you very much for the work that you've done, for all of us that have been inspired by the work that you guys have done. So I'm just going to be speaking briefly about some of the work that we have done earlier this year. Some of my mahi, Heurio no te whānau karuai ki Maraihara, karuai ki Wai o Matatini, te whānau Henerupe Ngāti Horowai Hoki. And I have been very fortunate to work in the field of environmental health and public health now for the last just over a decade. And it was my work through environmental health and well-being and Māori ideas of well-being, which include oranga taiao, that brought me back to Tūranga to work at Te Wānanga o Aotearoa in relation to environmental education, and now I work up here in Ngāti Porou in that same field. Through some of that mahi, I've also been very blessed to work in spaces, broad global spaces in relation to Indigenous well-being and environmental well-being. And one observation I noted is that at the United Nations, IUCN, UNESCO level, they're very clear that environmental well-being must take into account cultural realities, socio-economic realities. They must be culturally relevant and relevant to the people, the communities who rely upon that resource. And also, of course, the people who live around an awa don't need to be told that. We already know that if you don't have many people on the ground, you get overburdened by going to too many hui and you're too tired, and it's only a small group of people carrying a big kaupapa. But we know that you've got to put food on the table before you can think about attending the hui. We know that those things matter to us. Somewhere in the middle between those global aspirations and ideas around what it takes to make it work for the environment and what we already know, which usually involves something to do with central government and local government, those ideas get a little bit lost. So we've been working on those kinds of measures and understandings for us in the Waipu and along the Waipu catchment around what are the cultural realities, what are the cultural values, and the lived realities of whānau when it comes to talking about the well-being of our awa, of our wai, and our taiao. The name of the project that we started to do some of this work under was Te Poho Hutirangi. It was independently funded by an Indigenous women's fund based in South America, actually, called FEMI, which was an Indigenous Ways of Knowing and Learning fund around water governance. He Oranga Mō Ngauri Tuku Iho Trust, through Pia and Tui, were able to support us to go for that funding to do some of this work. Thanks. Out of all of that, and again, I have to thank Tui for giving the background to how we kind of came to be here. One of the fruits of the settlement was this joint management agreement between local government and ngā hapu o Ngāti Porou for the management of the Waiapu. A big part of that also, of course, is how do we, first of all, deal with the consents, resource consents that are coming in, and start to get whānau responding to some of those applications, or resource applications for activities that they wanted to carry out along the awa. How do we help whānau respond to those applications confidently? And then how do we help local government to also respond to our objections or approval of those consents? Another part of it also, though, is our catchment planning. So it's and we're moving towards now our Waiapu catchment plan. But of course, as I said at the beginning, these things ultimately work best when they're grounded and rooted in the reality, lived reality of the people on the ground. And that is very different if you are living on the ground at Tikapa to if you are living on the ground at Hiruharama. So we needed to find a way to start to bring forward some of those lived realities and relevancies of whānau at different points along the catchment. The project also wound up, because all of these things are interconnected, we wound up also gathering a lot of information around issues and concerns to do with things like myrtle rust, other taiao, ngahere related issues. But the core focus of it were these issues around resource consents and having whānau, hapu and landowners talk about what is culturally relevant and meaningful to them around the awa, so we can start to build a bottom-up catchment plan. Thanks. So the joint management agreement, I think it was in 2015? Yeah, November 2015 or October 2015 that it was signed. And then around about probably within the first 12 months, we started to identify some work streams that really needed to get going and that those work streams were best to get going on the ground level through marae, hapu and landowners. Thanks, Ange. Sorry, you can move on past that one. Yeah, so cultural well-being of freshwater. When we talk about all of the all of the different kinds of values that are monitored, usually by councils, local government, many of them are either E. coli levels. Many governments now, or local governments now, carry out rapid habitat assessment as well. Cultural well-being usually, especially for Indigenous peoples, moves beyond those ideas and incorporates and includes social ideas as well around, I think one of our whakatauki that we talked about earlier was healthy waterways, healthy lands and healthy people. So it very much acknowledges the fact that when the awa is unwell, we are unwell. And when we are scant on the ground also, that reflects in our ability to look after the awa and subsequently the well-being of the awa. So it asks us to, it's obviously that allows for however much diversity there is on the ground, is the kind of diversity that needs to come through in the planning process as well. It requires the people of that place to be able to define it, to be involved in its development, and also to monitor it as well, and to hold other groups accountable to those values that are being developed as well. It's dynamic, it's live, and it's shifting. You can't define cultural values in 2015 and set it in concrete and expect that to be all that it is from that point onwards. That's not how cultures work, that's not how communities work, so it needs to be able to, and it's a balancing act of having something that's longitudinal, that you can track and hold people to account over, but also allow for dynamic change as communities change as well. It's a fine balancing act. Yep, thanks, Ange. So the general overarching direction that we head in is looking at the cultural values as they are defined by hapu, marae and communities. We're at the point now where we're around about here. We're looking at creating the measures around some of those values that have been defined, and I'll show you some of the values a little bit further on. And we're in the phase now where we're reporting back to the hapu from the first set of hui. These are the values that you defined. How do you feel about these values? How do you feel about us using these questions to monitor those values? So one example would be most people have identified that whether or not we are holding on to our education knowledge of karakia, waiata, pūrākau, stories about the awa and traditions around harvesting in relation to the awa, many hapu have identified that as something that they want. So the questions that we would use to explore those issues, we are trying to keep similar along the catchment so that you can see how it moves along the catchment. Yeah, so we're in the point now where we're just reporting back to whānau to say, is this a reasonable reflection of what we've said? How do you feel about these questions? And start monitoring for those as well. Those are also issues that can be collated to respond and reflect the cultural well-being. What the people of the awa say is the level of well-being, and I should say that doesn't exclude technical questions like sediment loading, like E. coli levels, all of the different things that are of concern to our people that can be put together into a cultural wellbeing report, which is our next phase, and tracking it over time to see ngā piki me ngā heke. The primary resource for this is one that's intended to be for landowners and hapu and marae to be able to reflect back on what we have said matters and how that has performed over time, and whether or not we want to use that information to change our land use decision or maintain them. Yep. One example of how we can derive these kinds of things, and this isn't always the case, but this is one example, when you start looking at, well, where do we look to say that this is what matters to Ngāti Horowai and this is what matters to Te Whānau Rā Kairoa, are our waiata, our pūrākau, our whare whakairo, our artworks. All of our traditions are actually quite packed full of statements about taiao. Even whether a particular place or a particular species featured in a waiata or featured on a wall in a wharekai says something, because that's the message that's been enshrined by tipuna to be carried forth to us as ngā mokopuna. So we draw from all of these, and we have the ability to draw from a range of different kōrero that have been left for us. And then, of course, our own current lived experiences as well, to talk about the things that matter to us as Ngāti Porou around the Waiapu. And so this is just one of those examples, he tangi mō pāhui, that relates to ue pōhatu and also te wiwināti out towards Tikapa and the Ngutuawa as well. And there's a range of different references to species, places, but also the behaviour of the awa, the hydrology of the awa, sediment levels and debris. There are a range of different questions also, that come up in these wānanga that we held. What is it that matters to you? There hasn't been one instance where all of the same things have come up. It's all been a range of different values and issues that have mattered to people. Yep, Ange, thanks. So once we get into the wānanga, we wind up posing 4 key questions to our whānau to start to draw out responses. One is, how would you describe your relationship to the awa? And that is markedly different from, say, the mata to when that question alone had marked differences depending on how the awa behaved in the area, whether it was something to be fearful of or whether it was something that nourishes you and that you engaged very closely in. So that was an interesting question in and of itself. How do you know when it's well? So what are the markers for waiora for your area? Does it have to do with how the kai tastes? Does it have to do with whether you're swimming in it? All of those kinds of questions. How have you seen it impacted over the years? And what would you track or measure to understand how well or unwell it is? And out of those 4 pātai, you wound up spending a whole day in wānanga. A lot of people had really pointed, sometimes emotional, but very clear answers to these. And it's very distinctive from takiwā to takiwā along the Waiapu. Yes, Ange, thank you. So this is just an overview. It's not gone into detail yet, but this is just an overview of many of the responses that came back from various takiwā. Ue Pōhatu looked at te mana ake o te wai, mana tangata, mana whenua, mana atua, and mana tieki as values that describe their ability to gauge whether the awa is well or not. And as you see, we're starting to just kind of arrange them in a way, in a format that can help us to see some of the similarities. You can see that mahinga kai is something that matters to pretty much all of us. If we're able to still use our awa as a source of kai and feed our whānau from it and feed ourselves from it, that is a measure of cultural well-being that you will not find well, certainly not in Gisborne District Council's well-being standards. But also whakawhanaungatanga, so things that relate to, when we are able to gather around the awa, whether it be we're gathering to go for a swim, gathering to harvest a resource, gathering to look to access the kahawai run, but the kinds of community cohesion that occurs when you're able to gather around a resource. Those times that we would come together and tell stories and teach each other things and spend time together as a community. Ahi ka is another really interesting value that came through for many of our wānanga, not all, but many. So most people were also really interested in how are we maintaining our population around the awa as well, and how can the awa contribute towards that. So is the awa able to be used in a way that maintains economic development for our people so that we can stay at home and look after it and not join the exodus to the urban centres. Whakapapa and connections along the catchment were recognised by most hapu as well, so people are interested in what's happening, particularly the ones that are impacted the most downstream want to know what's happening upstream. So, and also the level of influence and I guess authority or influence that we have over the awa and over our sites that relate to the awa. So if we have an objection about something, is that being listened to? Are the pathways to local government clear, and our local government responding to our objections? So what's the level of mana that we actually hold to be able to affect a difference, positive or negative, in relation to our awa? So those are just some of the cultural values. Is there any more? No, there isn't. So in my next kōrero later on, I'll be talking about how we've actually also progressed, because it's one thing to define your values. The trick comes with monitoring them over time. implementation over time. So how do we have those grow into hapu catchment plans is the phase that we're at. But we're also have already begun our monitoring program back in July that includes a range of different monitoring methods, but also we're monitoring many values that have come through in this as well. So I'll be talking about that a little bit later on, so I won't get into it too much now, and I'll hop off the stage.